Section 1 of Weird Tales Double Feature. The Salem Horror and Black Kiss by Henry Kuttner and Robert Bloch. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Salem Horror by Henry Kuttner. When Carson first noticed the sounds in his cellar, he ascribed them to rats. Later, he began to hear the tales which were whispered by the superstitious Polish mill workers in Derby Street regarding the first occupant of the ancient house, Abigail Prynne. There was none living today who could remember the diabolical old hag, but the morbid legends which thrive in the witch district of Salem like rank weeds on a neglected grave gave disturbing particulars of her activities, and were unpleasantly explicit regarding the detestable sacrifices she was known to have made to a worm-eater, crescent-horned image of dubious origin. The oldsters still muttered of Abby Prynne and her monstrous boasts that she was high priestess of a fearful potent god which dwelt deep in the hills. Indeed, it was the old witch's reckless boasting which had led her to abrupt and mysterious death in 1692, about the time of the famous hangings on Gallows Hill. No one likes to talk about it, but occasionally a toothless crone would mumble fearfully that the flames could not burn her, for her whole body had taken on the peculiar anesthesia of her witch mark. Abby Prynne and her anomalous statue had long since vanished, but it was still difficult to find tenants for her decrepit, gabled house, with its overhanging second story and curious diamond-paned casement windows. The house's evil notoriety had spread throughout Salem. Nothing had actually happened there of recent years, which might give rise to the inexplicable tales, but those who rented the house had a habit of moving out hastily, generally with vague and unsatisfactory explanations connected with the rats. And it was a rat which led Carson to the witch room. The squealing and muffled pattering within the rotting walls had disturbed Carson more than once during the nights of his first week in the house, which he had rented to obtain the solitude that would enable him to complete a novel for which his publishers had been asking. Another light romance to add to Carson's long string of popular successes. But it was not until some time later that he began to entertain certain wildly fantastic surmises regarding the intelligence of the rat that scurried from under his feet in the dark hallway one evening. The house had been wired for electricity, but the bulb in the hall was small and gave a dim light. The rat was a misshapen black shadow as it darted a few feet away and paused apparently, watching him. At another time Carson might have dismissed the animal with a threatening gesture and returned to his work, but the traffic on Derby Street had been unusually noisy, and he had found it difficult to concentrate upon his novel. His nerves, for no apparent reason, were taut, and somehow it seemed that the rat, watching just beyond his reach, was eyeing him with sardonic amusement. Smiling at the conceit, he took a few steps toward the rat, and it rushed away to the cellar door, which he saw with surprise was ajar. He must have neglected to close it the last time he had been in the cellar, although he generally took care to keep the doors shut, for the ancient house was draughty. The rat waited in the doorway. Unreasonably annoyed, Carson hurried forward, sending the rat scurrying down the stairway. He switched on the cellar light and observed the rat in a corner. It watched him keenly out of glittering little eyes. As he descended the stairs, he could not help feeling that he was acting like a fool, but his work had been tiring, and subconsciously he welcomed any interruption. He moved across the cellar to the rat, seeing with astonishment that the creature remained unmoving, staring at him. A strange feeling of uneasiness began to grow within him. The rat was acting abnormally, he felt, and the unwinking gaze of its cold shoe-button eyes was somehow disturbing. Then he laughed to himself, for the rat had suddenly whisked aside and disappeared into a little hole in the cellar wall. Idly he scratched a cross with his toe in the dirt before the burrow, deciding that he would set a trap there in the morning. The rat's snout and ragged whiskers protruded cautiously. It moved forward, and then hesitated, drew back. Then the animal began to act in a singular and unaccountable manner, almost as though it were dancing, Carson thought. It moved tentatively forward, retreated again. It would give a little dart forward and be brought up short, then leap back hastily as though, the simile flashed into Carson's mind, a snake were coiled before the burrow, alert to prevent the rat's escape. But there was nothing there save the little cross Carson had scratched in the dust. No doubt it was Carson himself who blocked the rat's escape, for he was standing within a few feet of the burrow. He moved forward, and the animal hurriedly retreated out of sight. His interest piqued, Carson found a stick and poked it exploringly into the hole. As he did so, his eye, close to the wall, detected something strange about the stone slab just above the rat burrow. A quick glance around its edge confirmed his suspicion. The slab was apparently movable. Carson examined it closely, noticed a depression on its edge which would afford a handhold. His fingers fitted easily into the groove, and he pulled tentatively. The stone moved a trifle and stopped. He pulled harder, and with a sprinkling of dry earth, the slab swung away from the wall as though on hinges. A black rectangle, shoulder-high, gaped in the wall. From its depths, a musty, unpleasant stench of dead air welled out, and involuntarily Carson retreated a step. Suddenly he remembered the monstrous tales of Abby Prynne, and the hideous secrets she was supposed to have kept hidden in her house. Had he stumbled upon some hidden retreat of the long-dead witch? Before entering the dark gap, he took the precaution of obtaining a flashlight from upstairs. Then he cautiously bent his head and stepped into the narrow, evil-smelling passage, sending the flashlight's beam probing out before him. He was in a narrow tunnel, scarcely higher than his head, and walled and paved with stone slabs. It ran straight ahead for perhaps 15 feet, and then broadened out into a roomy chamber. As Carson stepped into the underground room, no doubt a hidden retreat of Abby Prynne's, a hiding place, he thought, which nevertheless could not save her on the day the fright-crazed mob had come raging along Derby Street, he caught his breath in a gasp of amazement. The room was fantastic, astonishing. It was the floor which held Carson's gaze. The dull gray of the circular wall gave place here to a mosaic of varicolored stone, in which blues and greens and purples predominated. Indeed, there were none of the warmer colors. There must have been thousands of bits of colored stone making up that pattern, for none was larger than a walnut, and the mosaic seemed to follow some definite pattern unfamiliar to Carson. There were curves of purple and violet mingled with angled lines of green and blue, intertwining in fantastic arabesques. There were circles, triangles, a pentagram, and other less familiar figures. Most of the lines and figures radiated from a definite point. The center of the chamber, where there was a circular disk of dead black stone perhaps 2 feet in diameter. It was very silent. The sounds of the cars that occasionally went past overhead in Derby Street could not be heard. In a shallow alcove in the wall, Carson caught a glimpse of markings on the walls, and he moved slowly in that direction, the beam of his light traveling up and down the walls of the niche. The marks, whatever they were, had been daubed upon the stone long ago, for what was left of the cryptic symbols was indecipherable. Carson saw several partly effaced hieroglyphics, which reminded him of Arabic, but he could not be sure. On the floor of the alcove was a corroded metal disc about 8 feet in diameter, and Carson received the distinct impression that it was movable. But there seemed no way to lift it. He became conscious that he was standing in the exact center of the chamber, in the circle of black stone where the odd design centered. Again he noticed the utter silence. On an impulse he clicked off the ray of his flashlight. Instantly he was in dead blackness. At that moment a curious idea entered his mind. He pictured himself at the bottom of a pit, and from above a flood was descending, pouring down the shaft to engulf him. So strong was this impression that he actually fancied he could hear a muffled thundering, the roar of the cataract. Then, oddly shaken, he clicked on the light, glanced around swiftly. The drumming, of course, was the pounding of his blood, made audible in the complete silence, a familiar phenomenon. But if the place was so still... The thought leaped into his mind as though suddenly thrust into his consciousness. This would be an ideal place to work. He could have the place wired for electricity, have a table and chair brought down, use an electric fan if necessary, although the musty odor he had first noticed seemed to have disappeared completely. He moved to the tunnel mouth, and as he stepped from the room he felt an inexplicable relaxation of his muscles, although he had not realized that they had been contracted. He ascribed it to nervousness and went upstairs to brew black coffee and write to his landlord in Boston about his discovery. The visitor stared curiously about the hallway after Carson had opened the door, nodding to himself as though with satisfaction. He was a lean, tall figure of a man, with thick steel-gray eyebrows overhanging keen gray eyes. His face, although strongly marked and gaunt, was unwrinkled. "About the witch room, I presume?" Carson said ungraciously. His landlord had talked, and for the last week he had been unwillingly entertaining antiquaries and occultists anxious to glimpse the secret chamber in which Abby Prynne had mumbled her spells. Carson's annoyance had grown, and he had considered moving to a quieter place. But his inherent stubbornness had made him stay on, determined to finish his novel in spite of interruptions. Now, eyeing his guest coldly, he said, "I'm sorry, but it's not on exhibition anymore." The other looked startled, but almost immediately a gleam of comprehension came into his eyes. He extracted a card and offered it to Carson. "Michael Leigh, occultist, eh?" Carson repeated. He drew a deep breath. The occultists, he had found, were the worst, with their dark hints of nameless things and their profound interest in the mosaic pattern on the floor of the witch room. "I'm sorry, Mr. Leigh, but I'm really quite busy. You'll excuse me." Ungraciously, he turned back to the door. "Just a moment," Leigh said swiftly. Before Carson could protest, he had caught the writer by the shoulders and was peering closely into his eyes. Startled, Carson drew back, but not before he had seen an extraordinary expression of mingled apprehension and satisfaction appear on Leigh's gaunt face. It was as though the occultist had seen something unpleasant, but not unexpected. "What's the idea?" Carson asked. "I'm not accustomed—" "I'm very sorry," Leigh said. His voice was deep, pleasant. "I must apologize, I thought. Well, again, I apologize. I'm rather excited, I'm afraid. You see, I've come from San Francisco to see this witch room of yours. Would you really mind letting me see it? I should be glad to pay any sum." Carson made a deprecatory gesture. "No," he said, feeling a perverse liking for this man growing within him. His well-modulated, pleasant voice, his powerful face, his magnetic personality. "No, I merely want a little peace. You have no idea how I've been bothered," he went on, vaguely surprised to find himself speaking apologetically. "It's a frightful nuisance. I almost wished I'd never found the room." Leigh leaned forward anxiously. "May I see it? It means a great deal to me. I am vitally interested in these things. I promise not to take up more than 10 minutes of your time." Carson hesitated, then assented. As he led his guest into the cellar, he found himself telling the circumstances of his discovery of the witch room. Leigh listened intently, occasionally interrupting with questions. "The rat. Did you see what became of it?" he asked. Carson looked surprised. "Why, no, I suppose it hid in its burrow. Why?" "One never knows," Leigh said cryptically as they came into the witch room. Carson switched on the light. He had had an electrical extension installed, and there were a few chairs and a table, but otherwise the chamber was unchanged. Carson watched the occultist's face, and with a surprise saw it become grim, almost angry. Leigh strode to the center of the room, staring at the chair that stood on the black circle of stone. "You work here?" he asked slowly. "Yes, it's quiet. I found I couldn't work upstairs. Too noisy. But this is ideal. Somehow I find it very easy to write here. My mind feels—" he hesitated. "Free, that is, disassociated with other things. It's quite an unusual feeling." Leigh nodded as though Carson's words had confirmed some idea in his own mind. He turned toward the alcove and the metal disc in the floor. Carson followed him. The occultist moved close to the wall, tracing out the faded symbols with a long forefinger. He muttered something under his breath, words that sounded like gibberish to Carson. "Nyoktha Yardnak." He swung about, his face grim and pale. "I've seen enough," he said softly. "Shall we go?" Surprised, Carson nodded and led the way back into the cellar. Upstairs, Leigh hesitated, as though finding it difficult to broach his subject. At length he asked, "Mr. Carson, would you mind telling me if you have had any peculiar dreams lately?" Carson stared at him, mirth dancing in his eyes. "Dreams?" he repeated. "Oh, I see. Well, Mr. Leigh, I may as well tell you that you can't frighten me. Your compatriots, the other occultists I've entertained, have already tried it." Leigh raised his thick eyebrows. "Yes, did they ask you whether you'd dreamed?" "Several did, yes." "And you told them?" "No." Then, as Leigh leaned back in his chair, a puzzled expression on his face, Carson went on slowly. "Although, really, I'm not quite sure." "You mean—" "I think... I have a vague impression that I have dreamed lately, but I can't be sure. I can't remember anything of the dream, you see. And, very probably your brother occultist put the idea into my mind." "Perhaps," Leigh said noncommittally, getting up. He hesitated. "Mr. Carson, I'm going to ask you a rather presumptuous question. Is it necessary for you to live in this house?" Carson sighed resignedly. "When I was first asked that question, I explained that I wanted a quiet place to work on a novel, and that any quiet place would do. But it isn't easy to find him. Now that I have this witch room and I'm turning out my work so easily, I see no reason why I should move, and perhaps upset my program. I'll vacate this house when I finish my novel, and then you occultists can come in and turn it into a museum or do whatever you want with it. I don't care. But until the novel is finished, I intend to stay here." Leigh rubbed his chin. "Indeed, I can understand your point of view. But is there no other place in the house where you can work?" He watched Carson's face for a moment and then went on swiftly. "I don't expect you to believe me. You are a materialist. Most people are. But there are a few of us who know that above and beyond what men call science, there is a greater science that is built on laws and principles which, to the average man, would be almost incomprehensible. If you had read Machen, you will remember that he speaks of the gulf between the world of consciousness and the world of matter. It is possible to bridge that gulf. The witch room is such a bridge. Do you know what a whispering gallery is?" "Eh?" Carson said, staring. "But there's no—" "An analogy. Merely an analogy. A man may whisper a word in a gallery, or a cave, and if you are standing in a certain spot 100 feet away, you will hear that whisper, although someone 10 feet away will not. It's a simple trick of acoustics, bringing the sound to a focal point, and this principle can be applied to other things besides sound, to any wave impulse, even to thought." Carson tried to interrupt, but Leigh kept on. "That black stone in the center of your witch room is one of those focal points. The design on the floor, when you sit on the black circle there, you are abnormally sensitive to certain vibrations, certain thought commands, dangerously sensitive. Why do you suppose your mind is so clear when you are working there? A deception, a false feeling of lucidity. For you are merely an instrument, a microphone, tuned to pick up certain malign vibrations, the nature of which you could not comprehend." Carson's face was a study in amazement and incredulity. "But you don't mean you actually believe—" Leigh drew back, the intensity fading from his eyes, leaving them grim and cold. "Very well, but I've studied the history of your Abigail Prim. She, too, understood this super-science of which I speak. She used it for evil purposes. The black art, as it is called. I have read that she cursed Salem in the old days, and a witch's curse can be a frightful thing. Will you—" He got up, gnawing at his lip. "Will you at least allow me to call on you tomorrow?" Almost involuntarily, Carson nodded. "But I'm afraid you'll be wasting your time. I don't believe— I have no—" He stumbled at a loss for words. "I merely wish to assure myself that you— Oh, another thing. If you dream tonight, will you try to remember the dream? If you attempt to recapture it immediately after waking, it is often possible to recall it." "All right, if I dream." That night, Carson dreamed. He awoke just before dawn with his heart racing furiously and a curious feeling of uneasiness. Within the walls and from below he could hear the furtive scurryings of the rats. He got out of bed hastily, shivering in the cold grayness of early morning. A wan moon still shone faintly in a paling sky. Then he remembered Leigh's words. He had dreamed. There was no question of that. But the content of his dream, that was another matter. He absolutely could not recall it to his mind, much as he tried, although there was a very vague impression of running frantically in darkness. He dressed quickly, and because the stillness of early morning in the old house got on his nerves, went out to buy a newspaper. It was too early for shops to be open, however, and in search of a newsboy he set off westward, turning at the first corner. And as he walked, a curious and inexplicable feeling began to take possession of him. A feeling of familiarity. He had walked here before, and there was a dim and disturbing familiarity about the shapes of the houses, the outline of the roofs. But, and this was the fantastic part of it, to his knowledge he had never been on this street before. He had spent little time walking about this region of Salem, for he was indolent by nature. Yet there was this extraordinary feeling of remembrance, and it grew more vivid as he went on. He reached a corner, turned unthinkingly to the left. The odd sensation increased. He walked on slowly, pondering. No doubt he had traveled by this way before, and very probably he had done so in a brown study, so that he had not been conscious of his route. Undoubtedly that was the explanation. Yet as Carson turned into Charter Street, he felt a nameless, uneasy waking within him. Salem was rousing. With daylight impassive, Polish workers began to hurry past him toward the mills. An occasional automobile went by. Before him a crowd was gathered on the sidewalk. He hastened his steps, conscious of a feeling of impending calamity. With an extraordinary sense of shock, he saw that he was passing the Charter Street burying ground, the ancient, evilly famous burying point. Hastily, he pushed his way into the crowd. Comments in a muffled undertone came to Carson's ears, and a bulky, blue-clad back loomed up before him. He peered over the policeman's shoulder and caught his breath in a horrified gasp. A man leaned against the iron railing that fenced the old graveyard. He wore a cheap, gaudy suit, and he gripped the rusty bars in a clutch that made the muscles stand out in ridges on the hairy back of his hands. He was dead, and on his face, staring up at the sky at a crazy angle, was frozen an expression of abysmal and utterly shocking horror. His eyes, all whites, were bulging hideously. His mouth was a twisted, mirthless grin. A man at Carson's side turned a white face toward him. "Looks as if he was scared to death," he said somewhat hoarsely. "I'd hate to have seen what he saw. Ugh, look at that face." Mechanically, Carson backed away, feeling an icy breath of nameless things chill him. He rubbed his hand across his eyes, but still that contorted dead face swam in his vision. He began to retrace his steps, shaken and trembling a little. Involuntarily his glance moved aside, resting on the tombs and monuments that dotted the old graveyard. No one had been buried there for over a century, and the lichen-stained tombstones with their winged skulls, fat-cheeked cherubs, and funeral urns seemed to breathe out an indefinable miasma of antiquity. What had frightened the man to death? Carson drew a deep breath. True, the corpse had been a frightful spectacle, but he must not allow it to upset his nerves. He could not. His novel would suffer. Besides, he argued grimly to himself, the affair was obvious enough in its explanation. The dead man was apparently a Pole, one of the group of immigrants who dwell about Salem Harbor. Passing by the graveyard at night, a spot about which eldritch legends had clung for nearly 3 centuries, his drink-befuddled eyes must have given reality to the hazy phantoms of a superstitious mind. These Poles were notoriously unstable emotionally, prone to mob hysteria and wild imaginings. The great immigrant panic of 1853, in which 3 witch houses had been burned to the ground, had grown from an old woman's confused and hysterical statement that she had seen a mysterious, white-clad foreigner take off his face. What else could be expected of such people, Carson thought. Nevertheless, he remained in a nervous state, and did not return home until nearly noon. When on his arrival he found Leigh, the occultist, waiting, he was glad to see the man, and invited him in with cordiality. Leigh was very serious. "Did you hear about your friend Abigail Prynne?" he asked without preamble, and Carson stared, pausing in the act of siphoning charged water into a glass. After a long moment he pressed the lever, sent the liquid sizzling and foaming into the whiskey. He handed Leigh the drink and took one himself, neat, before answering the question. "I don't know what you're talking about. What's she been up to?" he asked, with an air of forced levity. "I've been checking up on the records," Leigh said, "and I find Abigail Prynne was buried on December 14th, 1690, in the Charter Street burying ground, with a stake through her heart." "What's the matter?" "Nothing," Carson said tonelessly. "Well?" "Well, her grave's been opened and robbed, that's all. The stake was found uprooted nearby, and there were footprints all around the grave. Shoe prints. Did you dream last night, Carson?" Leigh snapped out the question, his gray eyes hard. "I don't know," Carson said confusedly, rubbing his forehead. "I can't remember. I was at the Charter Street graveyard this morning." "Oh, then you must have heard something about the man who—" "I saw him," Carson interrupted, shuddering. "It upset me." He downed the whiskey at a gulp. Leigh watched him. "Well," he said presently, "are you still determined to stay in this house?" Carson put down the glass and stood up. "Why not?" he snapped. "Is there any reason why I shouldn't? Huh?" "After what happened last night?" "After what happened? A grave was robbed. A superstitious Pole saw the robbers and died of fright. Well?" "You're trying to convince yourself," Leigh said calmly. "In your heart you know, you must know the truth. You've become a tool in the hands of tremendous and terrible forces, Carson. For 3 centuries, Abby Prynne has lain in her grave, undead, waiting for someone to fall into her trap, the witch room. Perhaps she foresaw the future when she built it, foresaw that some day someone would blunder into that hellish chamber and be caught by the trap of the mosaic pattern. It caught you, Carson, and enabled that undead horror to bridge the gulf between consciousness and matter, to get en rapport with you. Hypnotism is child's play to a being with Abigail Prynne's frightful powers. She could very easily force you to go to her grave and uproot the stake that held her captive, and then erase the memory of that act from your mind so that you could not remember it even as a dream." Carson was on his feet, his eyes burning with a strange light. "In God's name, man, do you know what you're saying?" Leigh laughed harshly. "God's name. The devil's name, rather. The devil that menaces Salem at this moment. For Salem is in danger. Terrible danger. The men and women and children of the town Abby Prynne cursed when they bound her to the stake, and found they couldn't burn her. I've been going through certain secret archives this morning, and I've come to ask you for the last time to leave this house." "Are you through?" Carson asked coldly. "Very well. I shall stay here. You're either insane or drunk, but you can't impress me with your poppycock." "Would you leave if I offered you $1,000? Leigh asked. "Or more than 10,000? I have a considerable sum at my command." "No, damn it!" Carson snapped in a sudden blaze of anger. "All I want is to be left alone to finish my novel. I can't work anywhere else. I don't want to. I won't." "I expected this," Leigh said, his voice suddenly quiet, and with a strange note of sympathy. "Man, you can't get away. You're caught in the trap, and it's too late for you to extricate yourself, so long as Abby Prynne's brain controls you through the witch room. And the worst part of it is that she can only manifest herself with your aid. She drains your life forces, Carson. Feeds on you like a vampire." "You're mad," Carson said dully. "I'm afraid. That iron disc in the witch room? I'm afraid of that, and what's under it. Abby Prynne served strange gods, Carson, and I read something on the wall of that alcove that gave me a hint. Have you ever heard of Nyogtha?" Carson shook his head impatiently. Leigh fumbled in a pocket, drew out a scrap of paper. "I copied this from a book in the Kester Library," he said. "A book called the Necronomicon, written by a man who delved so deeply into forbidden secrets that men called him mad. Read this." Carson's brows drew together as he read the excerpt. "Men know him as the Dweller in the Darkness, that brother of the Old Ones called Nyogtha, the thing that should not be. He can be summoned to Earth's surface through certain secret caverns and fissures, and sorcerers have seen him in Syria and below the Black Tower of Ling, from the Tong Grotto of Tartary. He has come ravening to bring terror and destruction among the pavilions of the Great Khan. Only by the Looped Cross, by the Vok-Viraj incantation, and by the Tikaun elixir may he be driven back to the nighted caverns of hidden foulness where he dwelleth." Leigh met Carson's puzzled gaze calmly. "Do you understand now?" "Incantations and elixirs?" Carson said, handing back the paper. "Fiddlesticks." "Far from it. The incantation and that elixir have been known to occultists and adepts for thousands of years. I've had occasion to use them myself in the past on certain occasions. And if I'm right about this thing—" He turned to the door, his lips compressed in a bloodless line. "Such manifestations have been defeated before, but the difficulty lies in obtaining the elixir. It's very hard to get, but I hope I'll be back. Can you stay out of the witch room until then?" "I'll promise nothing," Carson said. He had a dull headache which had been steadily growing until it obtruded upon his consciousness, and he felt vaguely nauseated. "Goodbye." He saw Leigh to the door and waited on the steps, with an odd reluctance to return to the house. As he watched the tall occultist hurry down the street, a woman came out of the adjoining house. She caught sight of him, and her huge breasts heaved. She burst into a shrill, angry tirade. Carson turned, staring at her with astonished eyes. His head throbbed painfully. The woman was approaching, shaking a fat fist threateningly. "Why you scare my Sarah?" she cried, her swarthy face flushed. "Why you scare her with your fool tricks, eh?" Carson moistened his lips. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. "Very sorry. I didn't frighten your Sarah. I haven't been home all day. What frightened her?" "The brown thing. It ran in your house, Sarah say." The woman paused, and her jaw dropped. Her eyes widened. She made a peculiar sign with her right hand, pointing her index and little fingers at Carson, while her thumb was crossed over the other fingers. "The old witch!" She retreated hastily, muttering in Polish in a frightened voice. Carson turned, went back into the house. He poured some whiskey into a tumbler, considered, and then set it aside untasted. He began to pace the floor, occasionally rubbing his forehead with fingers that felt dry and hot. Vague, confused thoughts raced through his mind. His head was throbbing and feverish. At length he went down to the witch room. He remained there, although he did not work, for his headache was not so oppressive in the dead quiet of the underground chamber. After a time he slept. How long he slumbered he did not know. He dreamed of Salem, and of a dimly glimpsed, gelatinous black thing that hurtled with frightening speed through the streets. A thing like an incredible, huge, jet-black amoeba that pursued and engulfed men and women who shrieked and fled vainly. He dreamed of a skull face peering into his own, a withered and shrunken countenance in which only the eyes seemed alive, and they shone with a hellish and evil light. He awoke at last, sat up with a start. He was very cold. It was utterly silent. In the light of the electric bulb, the green and purple mosaic seemed to writhe and contract toward him, an illusion which disappeared as his sleep-fogged vision cleared. He glanced at his wristwatch. It was 2:00. He had slept through the afternoon and the better part of the night. He felt oddly weak, and a lassitude held him motionless in his chair. The strength seemed to have been drained from him. The piercing cold seemed to strike through to his brain, but his headache was gone. His mind was very clear, expectant as though waiting for something to happen. A movement nearby caught his eye. A slab of stone in the wall was moving. He heard a gentle grating sound, and slowly a black cavity widened from a narrow rectangle to a square. There was something crouching there in the shadow. Stark, blind horror struck through Carson as the thing moved and crept forward into the light. It looked like a mummy. For an intolerable age-long second, the thought pounded frightfully at Carson's brain. It looked like a mummy. It was a skeleton-thin, parchment-brown corpse, and it looked like a skeleton with the hide of some great lizard stretched over its bones. It stirred. It crept forward, and its long nails scratched audibly against the stone. It crawled out into the witch room, its passionless face pitilessly revealed in the white light, and its eyes were gleaming with charnel life. He could see the serrated ridge of its brown, shrunken back. Carson sat motionless. Abysmal horror had robbed him of the power to move. He seemed to be caught in the fetters of dream paralysis, in which his brain, an aloof spectator, is unable or unwilling to transmit the nerve impulses to the muscles. He told himself frantically that he was dreaming, that he would presently awaken. The withered horror arose. It stood upright, skeleton-thin, and moved to the alcove where the iron disc lay embedded in the floor. Standing with its back to Carson, it paused, and a dry and sere whisper rustled out in the dead stillness. At the sound, Carson would have screamed, but he could not. Still, the dreadful whisper went on. In a language Carson knew was not of earth, and as though in response an almost imperceptible quiver shook the iron disc. It quivered and began to rise, very slowly, and as if in triumph, the shriveled horror lifted its pipe-stem arms. The disc was nearly a foot thick, but presently, as it continued to rise above the level of the floor, an insidious odor began to penetrate the room. It was vaguely reptilian, musky and nauseating. The disc lifted inexorably, and a little finger of blackness crept out from beneath its edge. Abruptly, Carson remembered his dream of a gelatinous black creature that hurtled through the Salem streets. He tried vainly to break the fetters of paralysis that held him motionless. The chamber was darkening, and a black vertigo was creeping up to engulf him. The room seemed to rock. Still the iron disc lifted. Still the withered horror stood with its skeleton arms raised in blasphemous benediction. Still the blackness oozed out in slow amoeboid movement. There came a sound breaking through the sere whisper of the mummy, the quick patter of racing footsteps. Out of the corner of his eye, Carson saw a man come racing into the witch room. It was the occultist Leigh, and his eyes were blazing in a face of deathly pallor. He flung himself past Carson to the alcove where the black horror was surging into view. The withered thing turned with dreadful slowness. Leigh carried some implement in his left hand, Carson saw, a crux ansata of gold and ivory. His right hand was clenched at his side. His voice rolled out, sonorous and commanding. There were little beads of perspiration on his white face. Ya na kadishtu nilkri stelsna yarnak flegtor. The fantastic, unearthly syllables thundered out, echoing from the walls of the vault. Leigh advanced slowly, the crux ansata held high, and from beneath the iron disk, black horror came surging. The disk was lifted, flung aside, and a great wave of iridescent blackness, neither liquid nor solid, a frightful gelatinous mass, came pouring straight for Leigh. Without pausing in his advance, he made a quick gesture with his right hand, and a little glass tube, hurtled at the black thing, was engulfed. The formless horror paused. It hesitated, with a dreadful air of indecision, and then swiftly drew back. A choking stench of burning corruption began to pervade the air, and Carson saw great pieces of the black thing flake off, shriveling as though destroyed with corroding acid. It fled back in a liquescent rush, hideous black flesh dropping as it retreated. A pseudopod of blackness elongated itself from the central mass, and like a great tentacle clutched the corpse-like being, dragged it back to the pit and over the brink. Another tentacle seized the iron disk, pulled it effortlessly across the floor, and as the horror sank from sight, the disk fell into place with a thunderous crash. The room swung in wide circles about Carson, and a frightful nausea clutched him. He made a tremendous effort to get to his feet, and then the light faded swiftly and was gone. Darkness took him. Carson's novel was never finished. He burned it, but continued to write, although none of his later work was ever published. His publishers shook their heads and wondered why such a brilliant writer of popular fiction had suddenly become infatuated with the weird and ghastly. "It's powerful stuff," one man told Carson as he handed back his novel, Black God of Madness. "It's remarkable in its way, but it's morbid and horrible. Nobody would read it. Carson, why don't you write the type of stuff you used to do, the kind that made you famous?" It was then that Carson broke his vow never to speak of the witch room, and he poured out the entire story, hoping for understanding and belief. But as he finished, his heart sank as he saw the other's face, sympathetic but skeptical. "You dreamed it, didn't you?" the man asked, and Carson laughed bitterly. "Yes, I dreamed it." "It must have made a terribly vivid impression on your mind. Some dreams do, but you'll forget about it in time," he predicted, and Carson nodded. And because he knew that he would only be arousing doubts of his sanity, he did not mention the thing that was burned indelibly on his brain, the horror he had seen in the witch room after awakening from his faint. Before he and Leigh had hurried, white-faced and trembling from the chamber, Carson had cast a quick glance behind him. The shriveled and corroded patches that he had seen slough off from that being of insane blasphemy had unaccountably disappeared, although they had left black stains upon the stones. Abby Prynne, perhaps, had returned to the hell she had served, and her inhuman god had withdrawn to hidden abysses beyond man's comprehension, routed by powerful forces of elder magic, which the occultist had commanded. But the witch had left a memento behind her, a hideous thing which Carson, in that last backward glance, had seen protruding from the edge of the iron disk, as though raised in ironic salute. A withered, claw-like hand. End of section 1. Section 2 of Weird Tales Double Feature, Salem Horror and Black Kiss, by Henry Kuttner and Robert Bloch. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Black Kiss. Chapter 1. The Thing in the Waters. Graham Dean nervously crushed out his cigarette and met Dr. Hedwig's puzzled eyes. "I've never been troubled like this before," he said. "These dreams are so oddly persistent. They're not the usual haphazard nightmares. They seem... I know it sounds ridiculous. They seem planned." "Dreams planned? Nonsense." Dr. Hedwig looked scornful. "You, Mr. Dean, are an artist, and naturally of impressionable temperament. This house at San Pedro is new to you, and you say you've heard wild tales. The dreams are due to imagination and overwork." Dean glanced out of the window, a frown on his unnaturally pale face. "I hope you're right," he said softly. "But dreams shouldn't make me look like this, should they?" A gesture indicated the great blue rings beneath the young artist's eyes. His hands indicated the bloodless pallor of his gaunt cheeks. "Overwork has done that, Mr. Dean. I know what has happened to you better than you do yourself." The white-haired physician picked up a sheet covered with his own scarcely decipherable notes and scrutinized it in review. "You inherited this house at San Pedro a few months ago, eh? And you moved in alone to do some work." "Yes, the seacoast there has some marvelous scenes." For a moment Dean's face looked youthful once more as enthusiasm kindled its ashy fires. Then he continued with a troubled frown. "But I haven't been able to paint lately. Not seascapes, anyway. It's very odd. My sketches don't seem quite right anymore. There seems to be a quality in them that I don't put there." "A quality, did you say?" "Yes, a quality of malignness, if I can call it that. It's indefinable. Something behind the picture takes all the beauty out. And I haven't been overworking these last weeks, Dr. Hedwig." The doctor glanced again at the paper in his hand. "Well, I disagree with you there. You might be unconscious of the effort you expend. These dreams of the sea that seem to worry you are meaningless, save as an indication of your nervous condition." "You're wrong." Dean rose suddenly. His voice was shrill. "That's the dreadful part of it. The dreams are not meaningless. They seem cumulative and planned. Each night they grow more vivid, and I see more of that green shining place under the sea. I get closer and closer to those black shadows swimming there. Those shadows that I know aren't shadows, but something worse. I see more each night. It's like a sketch I'd blocked out, gradually adding more and more until—" Hedwig watched his patient keenly. He suggested, "Until?" But Dean's tense face relaxed. He had caught himself just in time. No, Dr. Hedwig. You must be right. It's overwork and nervousness, as you say. If I believe what the Mexicans had told me about Morella Godolpho, well, I'd be mad and a fool." "Who is this Morella Godolpho? Some woman who has been filling you with foolish tales?" Dean smiled. "No need to worry about Morella. She was my great-great-grand-aunt. She used to live in San Pedro House and started the legends, I think." Hedwig had been scribbling on a slip of paper. "Well, I see, young man. You heard these legends. Your imagination ran riot. You dreamed. This prescription will fix you up." "Thanks." Dean took the paper, lifted his hat from the table, and started for the door. In the doorway he paused, smiling wryly. "But you're not quite correct in thinking the legends started me dreaming, Doctor. I began to dream before I learned the history of the house." And with that, he went out. Driving back to San Pedro, Dean tried to understand what had happened to him. But always he came up against a blank wall of impossibility. Any logical explanation wandered off into a tangle of fantasy. The one thing he could not explain, which Dr. Hedwig had not been able to explain, was the dreams. The dreams started soon after he came into his legacy, this ancient house north of San Pedro which had so long stood deserted. The place was picturesquely old, and that attracted Dean from the first. It had been built by one of his ancestors when the Spaniards still ruled California. One of the Deans, the name was Dina then, had gone to Spain and returned with a bride. Her name was Morella Godolpho, and it was this long-vanished woman about whom all the subsequent legends centered. Even yet, there were wrinkled, toothless Mexicans in San Pedro who whispered incredible tales of Morella Godolpho. She who had never grown old, and who had a weirdly evil power over the sea. The Godolphos had been among the proudest families of Granada, but furtive legends spoke of their intercourse with the terrible Moorish sorcerers and necromancers. Morella, according to these same hinted horrors, had learned uncanny secrets in the black towers of Moorish Spain, and when Dina had brought her as his bride across the sea, she had already sealed a pact with dark powers and had undergone a change. So ran the tales, and they further told of Morella's life in the old San Pedro house. Her husband had lived for 10 years or more after the marriage, but rumors said that he no longer possessed a soul. It is certain that his death was very mysteriously hushed up by Morella Godolpho, who went on living alone in the great house beside the sea. The whispers of the peons were hereafter monstrously augmented. They had to do with the change in Morella Godolpho, the sorcerous change which caused her to swim far out to sea on moonlit nights, so that watchers saw her white body gleaming amidst the spray. Men bold enough to gaze from the cliffs might catch glimpses of her then, sporting with queer sea creatures that gamboled about her in the black waters, nuzzling her with shockingly deformed heads. These creatures were not seals, or any known form of submarine life. It was averred, although sometimes bursts of chuckling, gobbling laughter could be heard. It is said that Morella Godolpho had swum out there one night and that she never came back. But thereafter the laughter was louder from afar, and the sporting amidst the black rocks continued, so that the tales of the early peons had been nourished down to the present day. Such were the legends known to Dean. The facts were sparse and inconclusive. The old house had fallen into decrepitude and was only occasionally rented through the years. These rentals had been as short as they were infrequent. There was nothing definitely wrong with the house between White's Point and Point Fermin, but those who had lived there said the crashing of the surf sounded subtly different when heard through windows that overlooked the sea, and too, they dreamed unpleasantly. Sometimes the occasional tenants had mentioned with peculiar horror the moonlit nights, when the sea became altogether too clearly visible. At any rate, occupants often vacated the house hastily. Dean had moved in immediately after inheriting, because he had thought the place ideal for painting the scenes he loved. He had learned the legend and the facts behind it later, and by this time his dreams had started. At first they had been conventional enough, though oddly all centered about the sea which he so loved, but it was not the sea he loved that he knew in sleep. The Gorgons lived in his dreams. Scylla writhed hideously across dark and surging waters, where harpies flew screaming, weird creatures crawling sluggishly up from the black inky depths where eyeless bloated sea beasts dwelt. Gigantic and terrible leviathans leaped and plunged, while monstrous serpents squirmed as strange obeisance to a mocking moon. Foul and hidden horrors of the sea's depths engulfed him in sleep. This was bad enough, but it was only a prelude. The dreams began to change. It was almost as though the first few formed a definite setting for the greater terrors to come. From the mythic images of old sea gods, another vision emerged. It was inchoate at first, taking definite form and meaning very slowly over a period of several weeks. And it was this dream which Dean now feared. It had occurred generally just before he awoke, a vision of green translucent light in which dark shadows swam slowly. Night after night the limpid emerald glow grew brighter, and the shadows twisted into a more visible horror. These were never clearly seen, although their amorphous heads held a strangely repellent, recognizable quality for Dean. Presently in this dream of his, the shadow creatures would move aside as though to permit the passage of another. Swimming into the green haze would come a coiling shape. Whether similar to the rest or not, Dean could not tell, for his dream always ended there. The approach of this last shape always caused him to awake in a nightmare paroxysm of terror. He dreamt of being somewhere under the sea, amidst swimming shadows with deformed heads, and each night one particular shadow was coming closer and closer. Each day now, when he awoke with the cold sea wind of early dawn blowing through the windows, he would lie in a lazy, languid mood till long past daybreak. When he rose these days, he felt inexplicably tired, and he could not paint. This particular morning, the sight of his haggard face in the mirror had forced him to visit a physician, but Dr. Hedwig had not been helpful. Nevertheless, Dean filled the prescription on the way home. A swallow of the bitter brownish tonic strengthened him somewhat, but as he parked his car, the feeling of depression settled down on him again. He walked up to the house, still puzzled and strangely afraid. Under the door was a telegram. Dean read it with a puzzled frown. "Just learned you are living in San Pedro house. Stop. Vitally important you vacate immediately. Stop. Show this cable to Dr. Makoto Yamada, 17 Buena Street, San Pedro. Stop. Am returning via airplane. Stop. See Yamada today. Michael Leigh." Dean read the message again, and a flash of remembrance came to him. Michael Leigh was his uncle, but he had not seen the man for years. Leigh had been a puzzle to the family. He was an occultist and spent most of his time delving in far corners of the earth. Occasionally he dropped from sight for long periods of time. The cable Dean held was sent from Calcutta, and he supposed that Leigh had recently emerged from some spot in the interior of India to learn of Dean's inheritance. Dean searched his mind. He recalled now that there had been some family quarrel about this very house years ago. The details were no longer clear, but he remembered that Leigh had demanded the San Pedro house be razed. Leigh had given no sane reasons, and when the request was refused, he had dropped out of sight for a time. And now came this inexplicable cablegram. Dean was tired from his long drive, and the unsatisfactory interview with the doctor had irritated him more than he had realized. Nor was he in the mood to follow his uncle's cable request and undertake the long journey to Buena Street, which was miles away. The drowsiness which he felt, however, was normal, healthy exhaustion, unlike the languor of recent weeks. The tonic he had taken was of some value after all. He dropped into his favorite chair by the window that overlooked the sea, rousing himself to watch the flaming colors of the sunset. Presently the sun dropped below the horizon, and gray dusk crept in. Stars appeared, and far to the north he could see the dim lights of the gambling ships off Venice. The mountains shut off his view of San Pedro, but a diffused pale glow in that direction told him that the New Barbary was wakening into roaring, brawling life. Slowly the face of the Pacific brightened. A full moon was rising above the San Pedro hills. For a long time Dean sat quietly by the window, his pipe forgotten in his hand, staring down at the slow swells of the ocean which seemed to pulse with a mighty and alien life. Gradually drowsiness crept up and overwhelmed him. Just before he dropped into the abyss of sleep, there flashed into his mind Da Vinci's saying, "The two most wonderful things in the world are a woman's smile and the motion of mighty waters." He dreamed, and this time it was a different dream. At first only blackness, and a roaring and thundering as of angry seas. And oddly mingled with this was the hazy thought of a woman's smile, and a woman's lips, pouting lips, softly alluring. But strangely the lips were not red. No, they were very pale, bloodless, like the lips of a thing that had long rested beneath the sea. The misty vision changed, and for a flashing instant Dean seemed to see the green and silent place of his earlier visions. The shadowy black shapes were moving more quickly behind the veil, but this picture was of but a second's duration. It flashed out and vanished, and Dean was standing alone on a beach he recognized in his dream, the sandy cove beneath the house. The salt breeze blew coldly across his face, and the sea glistened like silver in the moonlight. A faint splash told of a sea thing that broke the surface of the waters. To the north, the sea washed against the rugged surface of the cliff, barred and speckled with black shadows. Dean felt a sudden, inexplicable impulse to move in that direction. He yielded. As he clambered over the rocks, he was suddenly conscious of a strange sensation, as though keen eyes were focused upon him, eyes that watched and warned. Vaguely in his mind rose up the gaunt face of his uncle, Michael Leigh, the deep-set eyes glowing. But swiftly this was gone, and he found himself before a deeper niche of blackness in the cliff face. Into it he knew he must go. He squeezed himself between two jutting points of rock and found himself in utter dismal darkness. Yet somehow he was conscious that he was in a cave, and he could hear water lapping nearby. All about him was a musty salt odor of sea decay, the fetid smell of sunless ocean caves and holds of ancient ships. He stepped forward, and as the floor shelved sharply downward, stumbled and fell headlong into icy, shallow water. He felt, rather than saw, a flicker of swift movement, and then abruptly hot lips were pressed against his. Human lips, Dean thought, at first. He lay on his side in the chill water, his lips against those responsive ones. He could see nothing, for all was lost in the blackness of the cave. The unearthly lure of those invisible lips thrilled through him. He responded to them, pressed them fiercely, gave them what they were avidly seeking. The unseen waters crawled against the rocks, whispering warning. And in that kiss, strangeness flooded him. He felt a shock and a tingling go through him, and then a thrill of sudden ecstasy, and swift on its heels came horror. Black, loathsome foulness seemed to wash his brain, indescribable but fearfully real, making him shudder with nausea. It was as though unutterable evil were pouring into his body, his mind, his very soul, through the blasphemous kiss on his lips. He felt loathsome, contaminated. He fell back. He sprang to his feet. And Dean saw for the first time the ghastly thing he had kissed, as the sinking moon sent a pale shaft of radiance creeping through the cave mouth. For something rose up before him, a serpentine and seal-like bulk that coiled and twisted and moved toward him, glistening with foul slime. And Dean screamed and turned to flee with nightmare fear tearing at his brain, hearing behind him a quiet splashing, as though some bulky creature had slid back into the water. End of section 2. Section 3 of Weird Tales Double Feature, The Salem Horror and the Black Kiss, by Henry Kuttner and Robert Bloch. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Black Kiss, Chapter 2. A Visit from Dr. Yamada. He awoke. He was still in his chair before the window, and the moon was paling before the grayness of dawn. He was shaken with nausea, sick and shuddering with the shocking realism of his dream. His clothing was drenched with perspiration, and his heart hammered furiously. An immense lethargy seemed to have overwhelmed him, making it an intense struggle to rise from the chair and stagger to a couch, on which he flung himself to doze fitfully for several hours. A sharp pealing of the doorbell roused him. He still felt weak and dizzy, but the frightening lethargy had somewhat abated. When Dean opened the door, a Japanese standing on the porch began a bobbing little bow, a gesture that was abruptly arrested as the sharp black eyes focused on Dean's face. A little hiss of indrawn breath came from the visitor. Dean said irritably, "Well, do you want to see me?" The other was still staring, his thin face sallow beneath a stiff thatch of gray hair. He was a small, slender man, with his face covered with a fine-spun web of wrinkles. After a pause, he said, "I am Dr. Yamada." Dean frowned, puzzled. Abruptly, he remembered his uncle's cable of the day before. An odd, unreasonable irritation began to mount within him, and he said, more brusquely than he had intended, "This isn't a professional call, I hope? I've already—"
"Your uncle, you are Mr. Dean, cabled me. He was rather worried."
Dr. Yamada glanced around almost furtively. Dean felt distaste stir within him, and his irritation increased. "My uncle is rather eccentric, I'm afraid. There's nothing for him to worry about. I'm sorry you had your trip for nothing." Dr. Yamada did not seem to take offense at Dean's attitude. Rather, a strange expression of sympathy showed for a moment on his small face.
"Do you mind if I come in?"
he asked, and moved forward confidently. Short of barring his way, Dean had no means of stopping him, and ungraciously led his guest to the room where he had spent the night, motioning him to a chair while he busied himself with a coffee pot. Yamada sat motionless, silently watching Dean. Then, without preamble, he said,
"Your uncle is a great man, Mr. Dean."
Dean made a noncommittal gesture. "I've seen him only once."
"He is one of the greatest occultists of this day. I, too, have studied psychic lore, but besides your uncle, I am a novice."
Dean said, "He is eccentric. Occultism, as you term it, has never interested me." The little Japanese watched him impassively.
"You make a common error, Mr. Dean. You consider occultism a hobby for cranks. No," he held up a slender hand, "your disbelief is written in your face. Well, it is understandable. It is an anachronism, an attitude handed down from the earliest times, when scientists were called alchemists and sorcerers and burned for making pacts with the devil. But actually there are no sorcerers, no witches, not in the sense that man understands these terms. There are men and women who have acquired mastery over certain sciences which are not wholly subject to mundane physical laws."
There was a little smile of disbelief on Dean's face. Yamada went on quietly.
"You do not believe because you do not understand. There are not many who can comprehend, or who wish to comprehend, this greater science, which is not bound by earthly laws. But here is a problem for you, Mr. Dean." A little spark of irony flickered in the black eyes. "Can you tell me how I know you have suffered from nightmares recently?"
Dean jerked around and stood staring. Then he smiled. "As it happens, I know the answer, Dr. Yamada. You physicians have a way of hanging together, and I must have let something slip to Dr. Hedwig yesterday." His tone was offensive, but Yamada merely shrugged slightly.
"Do you know your Homer?"
he asked, apparently irrelevantly, and at Dean's surprised nod went on.
"And Proteus? You remember the old man of the sea, who possessed the power of changing his shape? I do not wish to strain your credulity, Mr. Dean, but for a long time students of the dark lore have known that behind this legend there exists a very terrible truth. All the tales of spirit possession, of reincarnation, even the comparatively innocuous experiments in thought transference, point to the truth. Why do you suppose folklore abounds with tales of men who have been able to change themselves into beasts? Werewolves, hyenas, tigers, the seal men of the Eskimos. Because these tales are founded on truth. I do not mean," he went on, "that the actual physical metamorphosis of the body is possible, so far as we know. But it has long been known that the intelligence, the mind, of an adept can be transferred to the brain and body of a satisfactory subject. Animals' brains are weak, lacking the power of resistance, but men are different, unless there are certain circumstances."
As he hesitated, Dean proffered the Japanese a cup of coffee. Coffee was generally brewing in the percolator these days, and Yamada accepted it with a formal little bow of acknowledgement. Dean drank his coffee in 3 hasty gulps and poured more. Yamada, after a polite sip, put the cup aside and leaned forward earnestly.
I must ask you to make your mind receptive, Mr. Dean. Don't allow your conventional ideas of life to influence you in this matter. It is vitally to your interest that you listen carefully to me and understand. Then perhaps...
He hesitated, and again threw that oddly furtive glance at the window.
Life in the sea has followed different lines from life on land. Evolution has followed a different course. In the great deeps of the ocean, life utterly alien to ours has been discovered. Luminous creatures which burst when exposed to the lighter pressure of the air. And in those tremendous depths, forms of life completely inhuman have been developed. Life forms that the uninitiated mind may think impossible. In Japan, an island country, we have known of these sea-dwellers for generations. Your English writer, Arthur Machen, has told a deep truth in his statement that man, afraid of these strange beings, has attributed to them beautiful or pleasantly grotesque forms, which in reality they do not possess. Thus we have the Nereids and Oceanids, but nevertheless man could not fully disguise the true foulness of these creatures. Therefore there are legends of the Gorgons, of Scylla and the Harpies, and significantly of the mermaids and their soullessness. No doubt you know the mermaid tale, how they long to steal the soul of a man and draw it out by means of their kiss.
Dean was at the window now, his back to the Japanese. As Yamada paused, he said tonelessly, "Go on."
I have reason to believe,
Yamada went on very quietly,
that Morella Godolpho, the woman from Alhambra, was not fully human. She left no issue. These things never have children. They cannot.
What do you mean? Dean had turned and was facing the Japanese, his face a ghastly white, the shadows beneath his eyes hideously livid. He repeated harshly, "What do you mean? You can't frighten me with your tales, if that's what you're trying to do. My uncle wants me out of this house, for some reason of his own. You're taking this means of getting me out, aren't you? Huh?"
You must leave this house,
Yamada said.
Your uncle is coming, but he may not be in time. Listen to me. These creatures, the sea-dwellers, envy man. Sunlight and warm fires and the fields of earth, things which the sea-dwellers cannot normally possess. These things, and love. You remember what I said about mind transference, the possession of a brain by an alien intelligence. That is the only way these things can attain that which they desire, and know the love of man or woman. Sometimes, not very often, one of these creatures succeeds in possessing itself of a human body. They watch always. When there is a wreck, they go there like vultures to a feast. They can swim phenomenally fast. When a man is drowning, the defenses of his mind are down, and sometimes the sea-dwellers can thus acquire a human body. There have been tales of men saved from wrecks, who ever after were oddly changed. Morella Godolpho was one of these creatures. The Godolphos knew much of the dark lore, but used it for evil purposes, the so-called black magic. And it was, I think, through this that sea-dweller gained power to usurp the brain and body of the woman. A transference took place. The mind of the sea-dweller took possession of Morella Godolpho's body, and the intelligence of the original Morella was forced into the terrible form of that creature of the abyss. In time, the human body of the woman died, and the usurping mind returned to its original shell. The intelligence of Morella Godolpho was then ejected from its temporary prison and left homeless. That is true death."
Dean shook his head slowly, as though in denial, but did not speak. And inexorably, Yamada kept on.
"For years, generations since then, she has dwelt in the sea waiting. Her power is strongest here, where she once lived. But as I told you, only under unusual circumstances can this transference take place. The tenants of this house might be troubled with dreams, but that would be all. The evil being had no power to steal their bodies. Your uncle knew that, or he would have insisted that the place be immediately destroyed. He did not foresee that you would ever live here."
The little Japanese bent forward, and his eyes were twin points of black light.
"You do not need to tell me what you have undergone in the past month. I know. The Sea Dweller has power over you. For one thing, there are bonds of blood, even though you are not directly descended from her. And your love for the ocean, your uncle spoke of that. You live here alone with your paintings and your imaginative fancies. You see no one else. You are an ideal victim, and it was easy for that sea horror to become en rapport with you. Even now, you show the stigmata."
Dean was silent, his face a pale shadow amidst the darker ones in the corners of the room. What was the man trying to tell him? What were these hints leading up to?
"Remember what I have said."
Dr. Yamada's voice was fanatically earnest.
"That creature wants you for your youth, your soul. She has lured you in sleep with visions of Poseidonus, the twilight grottos in the deep. She has sent you beguiling visions at first to hide what she was doing. She has drained your life forces, weakened your resistance, waiting until she is strong enough to take possession of your brain. I've told you what she wants, what all these hybrid horrors raven for. She will reveal herself to you in time, and when her will is strong upon you in slumber, you will do her bidding. She will take you down into the deep, and show you the kraken-fouled gulfs where these things bide. You will go willingly, and that will be your doom. She may lure you to their feasts there, the feasts they hold upon the drowned things they find floating from wrecked ships. And you will live such madness in your sleep because she rules you. And then, when you have become weak enough, she will have her desire. The sea thing will usurp your body and walk once more on earth, and you will go down into the darkness where once you dwelt in dreams forever. Unless I am mistaken, you have already seen enough to know that I speak truth. I think that this terrible moment is not so far off, and I warn you that alone you cannot hope to resist the evil. Only with the aid of your uncle and me."
Dr. Yamada stood up. He moved forward and confronted the dazed youth face to face. In a low voice he asked,
"In your dreams, has the thing kissed you?"
For a heartbeat there was utter silence. Dean opened his mouth to speak, and then a curious little warning note seemed to sound in his brain. It rose like the quiet roaring of a conch shell, and a vague nausea assailed him. Almost without volition he heard himself saying, "No." Dimly, as though from an incredibly far distance, he heard Yamada suck in his breath as if surprised. Then the Japanese said,
"That is good. Very good. Now listen, your uncle will be here soon. He has chartered a special plane. Will you be my guest until he arrives?"
The room seemed to darken before Dean's eyes. The form of the Japanese was receding, dwindling. Through the window the surf sound came crashing, and it rolled on in waves through Dean's brain. In its thunder, A thin, insistent whispering penetrated.
"Accept,"
it murmured.
"accept."
And Dean heard his own voice accept Yamada's invitation. He seemed incapable of coherent thought. That last dream haunted him. And now Dr. Yamada's disturbing story. He was ill, that was it. Very ill. He wanted very much to sleep now. A flood of darkness seemed to wash up and engulf him. Gratefully, he allowed it to sweep through his tired head. Nothing existed but the dark and a restless lapping of unquiet waters. Yet he seemed to know, in an odd way, that he was still, some outer part of him, conscious. He strangely realized that he and Dr. Yamada had left the house, were entering a car, and driving a long way. He was, with that strange, external other self, talking casually to the doctor, entering his house in San Pedro, drinking, eating, and all the while his soul, his real being, was buried in waves of blackness. Finally, a bed. From below, the surf seemed to blend into the blackness that engulfed his brain. It spoke to him now, as he rose stealthily and clambered out of the window. The fall jarred his outer self considerably, but he was on the ground outside without injury. He kept in the shadows as he crept away down to the beach, the black, hungry shadows that were like the darkness surging through his soul. End of section 3. Section 4 of Weird Tales Double Feature, The Salem Horror and the Black Kiss, by Henry Kuttner and Robert Bloch. The Black Kiss, Chapter 3. 3 Dreadful Hours. With a shock he was himself once more, completely. The cold water had done it, the water in which he found himself swimming. He was in the ocean, borne on waves as silver as the lightning that occasionally flashed overhead. He heard thunder, felt the sting of rain. Without wondering about the sudden transition, he swam on as though fully aware of some planned destination. For the first time in over a month he felt fully alive, actually himself. There was a surge of wild elation in him that defied the facts. He no longer seemed to care about his recent illness, the weird warnings of his uncle and Dr. Yamada, and the unnatural darkness that had previously shadowed his mind. In fact, he no longer had to think. It was as though he were being directed in all his movements. He was swimming parallel with the beach now, and with curious detachment he observed that the storm had subsided. A pale fog-like glow hovered over the lashing waters, and it seemed to beckon. The air was chill, as was the water, and the waves high. Yet Dean experienced neither cold nor fatigue, and when he saw the things that waited for him on the rocky beach just ahead, he lost all perception of himself in a crescendo of mounting joy. This was inexplicable, for they were the creatures of his last and wildest nightmares. Even now he did not see them plainly as they sported in the surf, but there were dim suggestions of past horror in their tenebrous outlines. The things were like seals, great fish-like bloated monsters with pulpy, shapeless heads. These heads rested on columnar necks that undulated with serpentine ease, and he observed without any sensation other than curious familiarity that the heads and bodies of the creatures were a sea-bleached white. Soon he was swimming in among them, swimming with peculiar and disturbing ease. Inwardly he marveled with a touch of his former feeling, that he was not now horrified by the sea beasts in the least. Instead, it was almost with a feeling of kinship that he listened to their strange low gruntings and cackles, listened and understood. He knew what they were saying, and he was not amazed. He was not frightened by what he heard, though the words would have sent abysmal horror through his soul in the previous dreams. He knew where they were going and what they meant to do when the entire group swam out into the water once more, yet he did not fear. Instead, he felt a strange hunger at the thought of what was to come, a hunger that impelled him to take the lead as the things, with undulant swiftness, glided through the inky waters to the north. They swam with incredible speed, yet it was hours before a seacoast loomed up through the murk, lit by a blinding flare of light from offshore. Twilight deepened to true darkness over the water, but the offshore light burned brightly. It seemed to come from a huge wreck in the waves just off the coast, a great hulk floating on the waters like a crumpled beast. There were boats gathered around it, and floating flares of light that revealed the scene. As though by instinct, Dean, with the pack behind him, headed for the spot. Swiftly and silently they sped, their slimy heads blurred in the shadows to which they clung as they circled the boats and swam in toward the great crumpled shape. Now it was looming above him, and he could see arms flailing desperately as man after man sank below the surface. The colossal bulk from which they leaped was a wreck of twisted girders, in which he could trace the warped outline of a vaguely familiar shape. And now, with curious disinterest, he swam lazily about, avoiding the lights, bobbing over the water as he watched the actions of his companions. They were hunting their prey. Leering muzzles gaped for the drowning men, and lean talons raked bodies from the darkness. Whenever a man was glimpsed in shadows not yet invaded by rescue boats, one of the sea things craftily snared his victim. In a little while they turned and slowly swam away. But now many of the creatures clutched a grisly trophy at their squamous breasts. The pale white limbs of drowning men trailed in the water as they were dragged off into the darkness by their captors. To the accompaniment of low carrion laughter, the beasts swam away, back down the coast. Dean swam with the rest. His mind was again a blur of confusion. He knew what that thing in the water was, and yet he could not name it. He had watched those hateful horrors snare doomed men and drag them off to the deep. Yet he had not intervened. What was wrong? Even now, as he swam with frightening agility, he felt a call he could not fully understand. A call that his body was answering. The hybrid things were gradually dispersing. With eerie splashings, they disappeared below the surface of the gelid black waters, pulling with them the dreadfully limp bodies of the men, pulling them down to the blackness biting beneath. They were hungry. Dean knew it without thinking. He swam on, along the coast, impelled by his curious urge. That was it. He was hungry. And now he was going for food. Hours of steady swimming southward, then the familiar beach, and above it a lighted house which Dean recognized, his own house on the cliff. There were figures descending the slope now. 2 men with torches were coming down to the beach. He must not let them see him. Why, he did not know, but they must not. He crawled along the beach, keeping close to the water's edge. Even so, he seemed to move very swiftly. The men with the torches were some distance behind him now. Ahead loomed another familiar outline, a cave. He had clambered over these rocks before, it seemed. He knew the pits of shadow that speckled the cliff rock, and knew the narrow passage of stone through which he now squeezed his prostrate body. Was that someone shouting far away? Darkness and a lapping pool. He crawled forward, felt chill waters creep over his body. Muffled by distance came an insistent shouting from outside the cave. "Graham! Graham Dean!" Then the smell of dank sea foulness was in his nostrils, a familiar, pleasant smell. He knew where he was now. It was the cave where, in his dream, he had kissed the sea thing. It was the cave in which... He remembered now. The black blur lifted from his brain, and he remembered all. His mind bridged the gap, and he once again recalled coming here earlier this very evening, before he had found himself in the water. Morella Godolpho had called him here. Here her dark whispers had guided him at twilight, when he had come from the bed at Dr. Yamada's house. It was the siren song of the sea creature that had lured him in dreams. He remembered how she had coiled about his feet when he entered, flung her sea-bleached body up until its inhuman head had loomed close to his own. And then the hot, pulpy lips had pressed against his. The loathsome, slimy lips had kissed him again. Wet, dank, horribly avid kiss. His senses had drowned in its evil, for he knew that this second kiss meant doom.
"The sea dweller will take your body,"
Dr. Yamada had said, and the second kiss meant doom. All this had happened hours ago. Dean shifted around in the rocky chamber to avoid wetting himself in the pool. As he did so, he glanced down at his body for the first time that night, glanced down with an undulating neck at the shape he had worn for 3 hours in the sea. He saw the fish-like scales, the scabrous whiteness of the slimy skin, saw the veined gills. He stared into the waters of the pool then, so that the reflection of his face was visible in the dim moonlight that filtered through fissures in the rocks. He saw all. His head rested on the long reptilian neck. It was an anthropoid head with flat contours that were monstrously inhuman. The eyes were white and protuberant. They bulged with the glassy stare of a drowning thing. There was no nose, and the center of the face was covered with a tangle of wormy blue feelers. The mouth was worst of all. Dean saw pale white lips in a dead face. Human lips. Lips that had kissed his own. And now they were his own. He was in the body of the evil sea thing. The evil sea thing that had once harbored the soul of Morella Godolpho. At that moment, Dean would gladly have welcomed death, for the stark, blasphemous horror of his discovery was too much to bear. He knew about his dreams now, and the legends. He had learned the truth, and paid a hideous price. He recalled vividly how he had recovered consciousness in the water, and swum out to meet those others. He recalled the great black hulk from which drowning men had been taken in boats, the shattered wreck on the water. What was it Yamada had told him?
"When there is a wreck, they go there, like vultures to a feast."
And now at last he remembered what had eluded him that night, what that familiar shape on the waters had been. It was a crashed zeppelin. He had gone swimming into the wreckage with those things, and they had taken men. 3 hours. God, Dean wanted very much to die. He was in the sea body of Morella Godolpho, and it was too evil for further life. Morella Godolpho, where was she? And his own body, the shape of Graham Dean. A rustling in the shadowy cavern behind him proclaimed the answer. Graham Dean saw himself in the moonlight, saw his body, line for line, hunching furtively past the pool in an attempt to creep away unobserved. Dean's flippered fins moved swiftly. His own body turned. It was ghastly for Dean to see himself reflected where no mirror existed. Ghastlier still to see that, in his face, there no longer were his eyes. The sly, mocking stare of the sea creature peered out at him from behind their fleshy mask, and they were ancient, evil. The pseudo-human snarled at him and tried to dodge off into the darkness. Dean followed, on all fours. He knew what he must do. That sea thing, Morella. She had taken his body during that last black kiss, just as he had been forced into hers. But she had not yet recovered enough to go out into the world. That was why he had found her still in the cave. Now, however, she would leave, and his Uncle Michael would never know. The world would never know either what horror stalked its surface,
until it was too late. Dean, his own tragic form hateful to him now, knew what he must do. Purposefully, he maneuvered the mocking body of himself into a rocky corner. There was a look of fright in those gelid eyes. A sound caused Dean to turn, pivoting his reptilian neck. Through glazed fish eyes, he saw the faces of Michael Leigh and Dr. Yamada. Torches in hand, they were entering the cave. Dean knew what they would do, and he no longer cared. He closed in on the human body that housed the soul of the sea beast, closed in with the beast's own flailing flippers, seized it in its own arms, and menaced it with its own teeth near the creature's white human neck. From behind him he heard shouts and cries at his back, but Dean did not care. He had a duty to perform, an atonement. Through the corner of his eye he saw the barrel of a revolver as it glinted in Yamada's hand. Then came 2 bursts of stabbing flame, and the oblivion Dean craved. But he died happy, for he had atoned for the black kiss. Even as he sank into death, Graham Dean had bitten with animal fangs into his own throat, and his heart was filled with peace as, dying, he saw himself die. His soul mingled in the 3rd black kiss of death. End of Section 4, and end of Weird Tales double feature, The Salem Horror and the Black Kiss, by Henry Kuttner and Robert Bloch. Read by Ben Tucker.